the psychological blindness that destroys men's relationships. Carl Jung made one of the most controversial statements in the history of psychology when he declared that the vast majority of men will never truly understand women because they lack the psychological development necessary to perceive feminine consciousness accurately. His shocking conclusion wasn't based on misogyny or intellectual superiority. It emerged from decades of clinical observation, showing that men consistently project their own psychological patterns onto women, creating fundamental misunderstandings that sabotage every attempt at genuine connection. Jung discovered that men's inability to understand women stems from their failure to develop what he called psychological differentiation, the capacity to perceive others as they actually are, rather than as extensions of their own unconscious needs, fears, and fantasies. This blindness isn't a character flaw, but a developmental limitation that prevents most men from ever experiencing authentic intimacy or building relationships based on genuine understanding rather than projection and illusion. Jung's devastating insight revealed that men approach women through what he termed anima projection, unconsciously imposing their idealized or feared feminine images onto actual women without ever seeing the real person underneath. This projection creates a psychological veil that makes genuine understanding impossible because men are essentially relating to their own unconscious contents rather than to the woman in front of them. They fall in love with their projections, become frustrated when real women don't match their fantasies, and blame women for being confusing or irrational when the real problem is their own inability to see clearly. The tragedy of this psychological blindness is that it creates a cycle of relationship failure where men repeatedly attract the same types of conflicts, misunderstandings, and disappointments because they never address the fundamental perceptual problem. They change partners but not their way of seeing, leading to what Jung called compulsive repetition of the same relationship patterns. Men who remain trapped in projection spend their entire lives searching for women who will match their unconscious images rather than learning to appreciate the complex reality of feminine consciousness. Have you ever noticed that your strongest attractions to women often occurred before you really knew them, and that getting to know them better sometimes diminished rather than increased your connection? Jung identified the first barrier to understanding women as what he called masculine literalism, the tendency to interpret feminine communication, emotion, and behavior through masculine psychological frameworks that completely miss the actual meaning. Men typically approach relationships through goal-oriented, problem-solving logical frameworks that work well for masculine psychology but create total misunderstanding when applied to feminine consciousness. They try to solve women's emotions instead of understanding them, interpret feminine communication literally instead of relationally, and expect linear consistency from consciousness that operates through cycles, moods, and contextual responses. This literalism creates what Jung observed as chronic misreading of feminine signals and needs. When women express emotions, men hear problems to be fixed rather than invitations to connection. When women share concerns, men offer solutions instead of presence and understanding. When women test relationships through emotional expression, men interpret these tests as criticism or irrationality rather than as attempts to gauge emotional safety and masculine strength. The deeper issue is that masculine consciousness operates primarily through what Jung called directed thinking, focused, goal-oriented, logical processing that seeks to understand through analysis and control. Feminine consciousness operates more through non-directed thinking, intuitive, associative, contextual processing that seeks to understand through relationship and emotional resonance. These different cognitive styles are equally valid and intelligent, but men often assume that their way of processing reality is the only legitimate approach. Jung emphasized that this isn't about intellectual capacity, but about psychological orientation. Many highly intelligent men remain completely baffled by feminine psychology because they're trying to understand it through masculine frameworks. Here it's like trying to understand music through mathematical analysis. You can measure frequency and amplitude, but you'll miss the emotional impact and aesthetic meaning that constitutes the essence of the musical experience. Can you think of times when you were certain you understood what a woman wanted or needed, only to discover later that you had completely misinterpreted her actual feelings or intentions? The second barrier Jung identified was emotional projection, men's tendency to assume that women experience and express emotions the same way men do, leading to catastrophic misunderstandings about feminine emotional nature. Men typically experience emotions as temporary states that arise in response to specific circumstances and can be resolved through action or logical analysis. They expect emotions to be proportional to their apparent causes and to follow predictable patterns of intensity and duration. Feminine emotional experience operates through what Jung called emotional complexity, layered, interconnected feelings that serve multiple psychological functions simultaneously. Women's emotions often carry information about relationship dynamics, safety assessment, intuitive perception, and creative inspiration that goes far beyond immediate circumstances. A woman's emotional response to a specific situation might actually be communicating about the overall health of the relationship, her sense of security, or subtle changes in her partner's energy that she's detecting unconsciously. Men who don't understand this complexity often invalidate women's emotions by trying to make them proportional to immediate logical causes. They say things like, "You're overreacting," or "It's not that big a deal," because they're measuring feminine emotions against masculine emotional patterns. This invalidation creates cycles of increasing emotional intensity as women try to communicate something important that isn't being received or understood. Jung observed that feminine emotions also serve what he called relational intelligence. They provide information about the subtle dynamics, power balances, and emotional currents within relationships that masculine consciousness often misses entirely. Women's emotional responses often detect problems, opportunities, or changes in relationship dynamics long before they become obvious to logical analysis. Men who dismiss these emotional signals as irrational often miss crucial information about their relationships. The third barrier to understanding women that Jung identified was sexual projection. Men's tendency to interpret women's behavior primarily through the lens of sexual attraction and availability, rather than understanding the full spectrum of feminine motivations, needs, and experiences. This reductionistic approach assumes that women's primary concern is sexual and romantic relationships, missing the complex reality of feminine psychology that includes career ambitions, creative expressions, spiritual development, social connections, and personal growth that may be far more important than romantic considerations. Sexual projection creates what Jung called Madonna whore syndrome, the inability to perceive women as complete human beings with the same complexity, contradictions, and multifaceted nature that men take for granted in themselves. Men often categorize women as either pure and spiritual or sexual and worldly, missing the integrated reality where women can be simultaneously spiritual and sensual, nurturing and ambitious, gentle and strong. This projection also leads men to misinterpret women's friendliness, kindness, or professional collaboration as romantic interest, creating uncomfortable situations and damaged relationships. Men who see women primarily through sexual frameworks often miss opportunities for genuine friendship, mentorship, and collaboration because they can't relate to women outside of romantic or sexual contexts. Have you found yourself confused or frustrated when women you were attracted to seemed more interested in discussing their careers, creative projects, or personal growth than in romantic or sexual topics? Jung's fourth barrier was what he termed cultural conditioning blindness. Men's inability to recognize how deeply their perceptions of women have been shaped by cultural stereotypes, media representations, and social expectations that have little connection to women's actual psychological reality. Most men unconsciously carry inherited images of what women should be like, based on cultural mythology rather than direct observation and authentic relationship. These cultural projections include assumptions about women being naturally nurturing, emotionally supportive, sexually available, domestically oriented, or relationally focused that may not apply to specific individuals. Men often feel disappointed or confused when actual women don't match these culturally programmed expectations, not realizing that they're comparing real people to cultural fantasies. Jung emphasized that understanding women requires what he called cultural deprogramming, consciously examining and questioning inherited assumptions about feminine nature. This means learning to see each woman as an individual, with her own unique psychology, goals, challenges, and ways of being, rather than as a representative of cultural categories or stereotypes. The solution Jung proposed for developing genuine understanding of women involves what he called psychological individuation, the development of consciousness that can perceive others clearly without the distortion of projection, assumption, or cultural conditioning. This requires men to become aware of their own unconscious contents, particularly their anima projections, and to develop the emotional intelligence and relational skills necessary for authentic perception. The first step in Jung's method is projection withdrawal, learning to recognize when you're relating to your own unconscious images rather than to the actual person in front of you. This requires developing what he called psychological objectivity, the ability to observe your own reactions, assumptions, and interpretations while remaining open to information that contradicts your expectations. Projection withdrawal involves asking questions like, am I seeing this woman as she actually is, or am I seeing her through the filter of my own needs, fears, or fantasies? What assumptions am I making about her motivations, feelings, or intentions? How might my cultural conditioning be influencing my perceptions of her behavior? The second step is empathetic development, learning to understand feminine consciousness from the inside, rather than trying to interpret it through masculine frameworks. This requires what Jung called psychological flexibility, the ability to temporarily adopt different ways of processing reality in order to understand others' experiences. Men must learn to think relationally rather than just logically, to value emotional information alongside factual data, and to appreciate cyclical and contextual ways of understanding alongside linear analysis. Empathetic development means learning to ask better questions. What is she actually trying to communicate through this emotion? What kind of response would help her feel understood and supported? How might this situation feel different from her perspective than it does from mine? Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to develop the psychological awareness that enables genuine understanding of women, rather than projecting your own assumptions onto them. Like this video if you believe that authentic relationships require seeing others clearly, rather than through the distortion of unconscious projection. Share this content with someone who's ready to move beyond cultural stereotypes and develop real empathy and understanding. Jung's third step involves relational intelligence development, learning to navigate the complex dynamics of feminine consciousness with skill and sensitivity rather than trying to control or simplify them. This means developing comfort with emotional complexity, cyclical patterns, and contextual responses that don't fit masculine preferences for consistency and predictability. Relational intelligence includes learning to be present with emotions without trying to fix or change them, to provide emotional support without taking responsibility for others' feelings, and to maintain your own center while remaining genuinely open to others' experiences. Men who develop this capacity often find that their relationships become much more satisfying and authentic because they're finally connecting with real women rather than their projections of women. The fourth step is authentic curiosity cultivation, developing genuine interest in understanding women's actual experiences, perspectives, and inner worlds, rather than assuming you already know what they're thinking or feeling. This requires what Jung called beginner's mind, approaching each woman and each interaction with fresh openness rather than predetermined expectations. Authentic curiosity means asking open-ended questions and really listening to the answers, paying attention to subtle communication beyond just words, and being willing to be surprised by information that doesn't match your assumptions. It means valuing women's perspectives as sources of valuable information about reality rather than dismissing them as emotional or irrational. Jung's method also emphasizes the importance of shadow work, becoming conscious of the rejected aspects of your own personality that you might be projecting onto women. Many men project their own rejected emotions, intuition, or relational needs onto women, and then find these qualities attractive or threatening in feminine partners. Understanding your own shadow helps you see women more clearly by reducing the unconscious material you're projecting onto them. The transformative results of Jung's approach often surprise men who apply it seriously. They discover that women are far more complex, intelligent, and interesting than their projections suggested. They find that relationships become more authentic and satisfying when based on genuine understanding rather than fantasy fulfillment. They often develop much better friendships with women because they can relate to them as complete human beings rather than just potential romantic partners. Men who develop the capacity to understand women's true nature often find that their attractiveness to women increases significantly because women sense that they're being seen and appreciated for who they actually are, rather than being evaluated against unconscious projections. This authentic recognition creates deep attraction and respect that goes far beyond surface-level chemistry or compatibility. The broader implications of Jung's insights suggest that most relationship problems stem from perceptual blindness rather than actual incompatibility. Men who learn to see women clearly often discover that many of their previous relationship conflicts were based on misunderstandings and false assumptions rather than genuine differences or problems. Jung's warning about men's inability to understand women serves as both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is that developing this understanding requires significant psychological work and the willingness to question deeply held assumptions about feminine nature. The opportunity is that men who undertake this development often discover relationships of depth, authenticity, and mutual appreciation that they never imagined possible. Your own experience of confusion or frustration in relationships with women may indicate that you're relating through projection rather than genuine perception. Jung's method offers a path toward the psychological development that enables authentic understanding and connection based on seeing others clearly, rather than through the distortion of unconscious assumption and cultural conditioning. The ultimate insight from Jung's analysis is that understanding women's true nature requires men to develop psychological capacities that benefit every area of life. The same skills that enable genuine perception of feminine consciousness also enhance leadership, friendship, parenting, and creative expression by developing the emotional intelligence and relational awareness that characterize psychological maturity and authentic human connection.